everyone and welcome back to the channel. I'm actually refilming this intro to this particular video that was originally supposed to be a reading vlog and actually ended up being a full-scale analysis slash in-time thoughts and reactions video to this book, the nonfiction, The Hidden History of Burma, A Crisis of Race and Capitalism. I received this in the mail and needed to read it right away, and this video just ended up being my immediate thoughts and reactions, and that's all this video is. The reason I want to refilm this intro is because I wanted to also add the caveat and sort of a disclaimer that I don't have a background in economics or finance or cultural identity, Asian history, or anything like that. Reading this one particular book has not made me an expert on this particular subject. This video really is just my at the moment reaction to what I'm reading, and nothing should be considered as a declared statement or a declared opinion on anything whatsoever. It's just a reaction. So I just wanted to add that information into the introduction, and it's definitely something I repeat at the end of the video. But yeah, that's just what I wanted to present. This book was absolutely fascinating. There's so much to take from it, and it's definitely recommended. Even if you don't want to watch this video, if you're looking for an excellent nonfiction about the current crisis in Burma, this is absolutely superb, highly recommended. In any case, definitely feel free to watch this video. And for those of you who are brave enough, if anyone wants to tally up the number of times I use the word interesting in this video, please leave it in the comment. I haven't done it myself, but I'd be really interested to see how many times I actually use that word, because I pretty much used it every 30 seconds, I believe. Because everything was interesting, I can't help it. Everything was fascinating, everything was interesting. There was just so much to process. Anyway, that is The Hidden History of Burma, and let's go to the rest of the video. Already on page 79, which is unfortunate because I initially had intended to start a vlog when I started this book, but I was anticipating it so much that I kind of just started right away. But there's just so much to say about it. So I was actually introduced to this book by Anderson Cooper. He had tweeted about how he thought this book was a must read to understand the current situation in Myanmar/Burma, which actually the naming of Myanmar and Burma for the country, the author does actually explain in his introduction, and along with explaining why he chose to go with the word Burma and not with the name Myanmar. But yeah, Anderson Cooper had tweeted about this, and this was actually right before, like maybe not even a month before the current situation happened, where the military retook control of the country. So I mean, just the timing was absolutely fantastic. I'm not going to say fantastic about a military coup, but the timing was extraordinary. It was actually quite remarkable. But yeah, it's so the author is actually Burmese, and he's a historian, and he actually did take quite a bit part in sort of you know, talking about Burma. He's had lots of sessions with political leaders, and he's been in front of the UN discussing Burma and the sanctions that were placed upon Burma, and what he feels is the direction we should go in. So it's incredibly fascinating. I mean, this man is very much a part of this issue, which is, I think, makes this book in so far very well done. He understands it so well. And actually already I'm very interested in his other books. One being The Making of Modern Burma, which is about the 19th century Burmese society and the transition to colonial rule. I think that'll be super fascinating. And then he wrote another book on Burmese history called The River of Lost Footsteps. I'm not too sure which part of Burmese history that focuses on, but I think, I mean, just looking at the quality of writing of this book and like the ease of within the presentation of the information, I think that those two books would be incredibly worthwhile reads. So I will definitely be looking into that. But yeah, it's incredibly interesting. So he starts the book with the introduction, explaining his choice behind using the word Burma instead of Myanmar, and just that was incredibly fascinating. And then he goes into describing the progression, just a brief description of the progression of Burma from its early stages, when it had all the different people in different regions, and how they sort of expanded from there, and then the kingdoms that were existed within Burma. And then after that, when the British came in, and so when they were under the British colonial rule, how that affected the country, and then basically goes into modern history. But I mean, so far, the main gist you can get from this is that let's blame the British. We can just blame the British for all of Burma's problems. But it's really, really fascinating, because he introduces this concept that about Burmese nationality, and that it's not really based on religion, it's not really based on race. There's a certain quality that makes Burma very different than other countries that have been under a dictatorship, such as North Korea, Somalia, etc., etc. So there's a very so when he discusses about how other countries, how the Western countries are dealing, or what they think is helping with the situation, he says it's just not going in the right direction, because they don't understand the actual crisis, the actual reason behind Burma. They don't understand the actual makeup of Burma, and so that just makes it really, really fascinating. And right now, it's very much talking about the foreign powers and the sanctions they are placing on Burma, and how the sanctions are supposed to be punishing Burma, but not exactly punishing Burma, but punishing the military junta. And so by not providing any funds to Burma, and preventing business to go into Burma, preventing Burma from being able to build up a tourism trade so that they can build money, and that they feel that would encourage the dictatorship, a military dictatorship. So instead they do all these sanctions. But the author, it's very interesting, because he's saying that these sanctions are the very things, it's really the direction we can't go, because the thing is that the sanctions are actually killing the infrastructure of Burma more so than if they didn't have the sanctions. And what he is saying is that the foreign powers aren't listening to the Burmese people. It's the people are protesting the economic conditions, they're protesting the health conditions, they're protesting the fact that they can't get jobs, that they're being sold into slavery, they're being trafficked into China, they're being trafficked into Thailand, etc., etc. And the foreign powers are going, you see, your people want a democracy. And the author is saying, no, the people don't want a democracy, the people want freedom of economy. So it's incredibly fascinating so far. It's very, very interesting. And I just read this one sentence, which is what triggered me to film this little section, is that I began to understand more clearly that the roots of Burma's problem lay not just in its military dictatorship, but in the peculiar nationalism that had led to war, isolation, and impoverishment. What Burma needed now was not simple regime change, but a more radical process of transformation. And he says that lifting the embargo would do that, because it would force Burma to change, because they would actually have the money to do it instead of everything being controlled by the military. And he discusses the sense of nationalism quite a bit in this book, and it's very, very interesting, because it's definitely very different than say an American sense of nationalism, a French sense of nationalism, an Argentinian sense of nationalism. It's very, very, very different, just because Burma has never really been one particular identity. It's always been a conglomeration of certain kingdoms and certain nationalities and certain religions. So yeah, super, super fascinating. So now we've discussed the major cyclone that hit Burma and the ramifications of that, and how that it opened up the country a little bit more for organizations like NGOs. So we've covered that, and now we're getting back into basically the constitution that was being written, that was being created to lead way for the junta basically dissolving itself. And it's interesting because I'm on the part where it's talking about certain provisions of the constitution, and I think the wording is quite interesting. For example, this part: the constitution also prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, birth, religion, and sex. It did, however, add the qualifier that nothing should prevent the appointment of men to positions that are suitable for men only. I thought that was interesting, because that, I don't know, is that contradictory to what it just said? Is it not contradictory? It's interesting. It's an interesting qualifier that I'm not exactly understanding its significance, but yeah. Then it goes into basically, so Burma is very proud of its history. It's many times in this book, it discusses how if you speak to a Burmese person, they're very insistent on discussing the history first, because Burma wants the world to understand its history. It needs the world to understand its history. And they're opening up the constitution and talking about multinational races. So as I mentioned, Burma is very much made up of many kingdoms that came together, and with that, it has multiple races in a sense. But it was always very careful to distinguish the non-Burmese face versus the Burmese face. So even though Burma is made up of all of these kingdoms, they all have what they consider a Burmese face, compared to the outsiders, which would be Europeans, so white Europeans, or it doesn't mention Africa that much, so it doesn't really mention anything about like black Africans or anything like that. It's mostly about Europeans, Americans, but even that, it focused more on the idea of white Americans, and then Indians, so people from the country of India. And also, obviously, Bangladesh, Thailand, Laos, it mentions all those things. So all these people are outsiders. And it's interesting because this leads, obviously, to the concept of the Rohingya, which is the big humanitarian crisis currently and going on in Burma. And it's interesting because the author says, I've heard many Burmese warn that giving Muslims in northern Thant Myint-U status as Rohingya, so that status basically means like if this population is at least 0.1% of the national populace, then they're entitled to representation. So Rohingya would be given that status because they have enough of a population that they're entitled to representation. And so a lot of Burmese are saying by giving them this status, it would lead automatically to their being entitled to a zone of their own, which means a part of Burma would fall under Sharia law. And so that's going to be very important, because when it comes to the identity of the Burmese, you're going to get into the question of, do we consider Rohingya Burmese, or do we consider them outsiders? So it's going to be very interesting. That's going to lead up to a very interesting point later on that I'm looking forward to reading. I think there's another thing I kind of want to reflect on, and it's because many times the author mentions like Western celebrities, and they're putting their opinion into the matter. So it mentioned when Jim Carrey did a YouTube video. It's also talking about, Free Burma. He mentions Jennifer Aniston, and it's always in these fleeting comments. For example, With Aung San Suu Kyi's 64th birthday approaching, he, the UK Prime Minister, promised to do all we can to make this birthday the last you spend without your freedom. And then our author adds in the next sentence, David Beckham, Daniel Craig, Kevin Spacey, and George Clooney all sent words of encouragement. And it's very interesting that he always inserts these just single sentences of this celebrity sent a letter, this celebrity did a YouTube video, this celebrity sent words of encouragement. And I really find that interesting because it's really like he's making a commentary about how really unaware the West is. They're showing this concern for something they don't understand, and that makes it very, very interesting because, you know, I'm reading this book, but because I'm discussing this book in this video that I plan on posting on YouTube, but because I'm not a celebrity, does that make me better than these celebrities that are making these comments? Does it make me more educated than them? Does it make me less educated than them? So it's interesting. Like, are the celebrities' voices, how much importance should we put on them? I know many people are like, I don't care what Jennifer Aniston thinks. I don't care what George Clooney thinks. But are you assuming that you know more than them, or are you assuming they don't know anything? So it's a really, really interesting, I don't know, it leads to an interesting reflection on that concept, because similarly, like I just mentioned, me reading this one book on Burma is not going to make me suddenly an expert on the situation and on the crisis of Burma, and it does make me an expert on the past history of Burma, the current history of Burma, and it doesn't make me an expert on any future events in Burma. So I think it's very interesting how he adds those little single sentence comments about the Western celebrities. So yeah, been a few days since my last update because I've been doing things. I've been hanging out with people. But I'm currently about 60 pages away from the end of this book, and I have just read about the economic upheaval of Burma, which has been very, very, very interesting. And it's interesting because it turns out it's actually the result of the previous leader of the military junta in Burma, who wanted to set up a safe and cushy retirement for himself. And so basically he had observed what had happened with previous leaders of other countries that had been considered dictators, and he saw what happened to them post-retirement. And so to avoid any sort of attempts of being assassinated or being prosecuted by the new government or things like that, he basically almost established an ideal government. Why he couldn't do that when he was leader, I don't know. That's a lot of abuse of power, and there's a lot to be said about self-ego. But yeah, he basically set up this like ideal government so that people would be distracted by the really good government, and they would kind of forget that he was a dictator, basically. So I thought that was very interesting and very amusing. But yeah, so I've read about the upheaval about the economy, and what's really interesting is that basically Burma was going through this really incredible, just like instantaneous progress that really made Burma almost this like amazing textbook example of what can happen if everyone just sort of collaborates. But what's interesting is that after that chapter of showing all the good that's happened from this new non-primarily military governed government, and so also our obviously by this time Aung San Suu Kyi has been released from house arrest at the time, during this time. But what's really interesting is obviously during all this economic upheaval, the author is reminding us that we can't forget that there's still this huge illegal trade happening. There's a lot of issues. There's a lot of problems with border control. There's also, you know, the ethnic disputes still remain. And I think that's really interesting. And I think there's this one paragraph that really, really explains very well the chaos of Burma, which is what the author is really trying to instill in us. And I wanted to read that. So basically, it's a comment that a mediator from the UN made when he was talking about his observations of Burma, and this is in 2013. And the mediator states, "This is the most complex situation I've ever seen in my life." I had to restart, I lost my words there a little. So he says, "This is the most complex situation I've ever seen in my life." And then basically our author states that this UN mediator had served in a dozen conflict situations in Latin America, Africa, the Balkans, and Asia. So basically stating that this person has a lot of experience. And so he says, "There was the peace process involving the government, which in turn was divided between the president, his cabinet, the army, and parliament, and then dozens of ethnic armed organizations, with other insurgencies and militia sitting on the sidelines. Then there's also the contest between the generals and ex-generals, and Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy, as well as dozens of other political parties and now hundreds of civil society organizations, all wanting a say in the future of the country. Then there's also the rising violence between Buddhists and Muslims, mainly in Arakan, but spilling over into other parts of the country. And then on top of that, you have the big powers, including China, the US, Japan, India, the UK, and a host of other governments who are jostling for influence." So you have this, you know, Burmese economy that's trying to really get out of its original military junta. But in the forefront, but also in the background, you have all these people who are just like really vying for influence and trying to, not even trying, but, you know, some are genuinely helping. But, you know, usually, you know, when you help, there's still some sort of political motivation or goal behind it. But you have all these voices that are coming in at once that creates this really complex situation and a really huge sense of chaos. So that's been really, really, really interesting. And then there's also talking about sort of, again, the education system and this concept of race. And the author goes further on to say, "Fear and intolerance were easy to kindle where there was a failure of the imagination. No history other than nationalist mythology had been taught in schools or universities for generations. Isolation bred insecurity, and the idea that race, ethnicity, and identity could be mutable, evolving, and contingent was nowhere to be found across the Burmese political spectrum. The peace process, in a way, only entrenched the notion that there were fixed ethnic groups around which everything else must be structured. International advisors did little to suggest a more useful approach." So it's incredible. It's super, super fascinating, and just, I mean, it is indeed utter pure chaos. And so now I'm finally going into the concept, not the concept, but I'm going behind into the Rohingya crisis, which is very, very interesting because I've just entered this part, but basically this whole concept of the Rohingya is actually a term that the Burmese never used themselves, and was mostly a term being used by Western nations, which makes it interesting because, again, the author keeps saying how the West is distracted by everything but the actual crisis in Burma, the actual situation in Burma. And I think that's really, really, what's the word? Oh, goodness. That's very, that's very effectively demonstrated. It's still not the word I'm looking for, but effectively demonstrated by the actual real absence of talking about Aung San Suu Kyi, and until now hasn't actually talked about the Rohingya Muslims all that much, because those are the two subjects that I think most Western people know about when you talk about Burma, including myself. Because if you were to go back to the beginning of this video, I state explicitly how interested I am to get to those topics. And what's interested is realizing that me being interested in those topics is because of Western media influence focusing on those topics. So I think that's really, really, really interesting. So that's where I'm at. So we're reaching that point of the story. I also kind of, since this is a booktube, there is a page, not a page, there's a paragraph about the Nobel laureate Pablo Neruda, who's very, very famous Chilean literary influence. And there's a fun paragraph I wanted to mention about him. So right now the author has made it an effort to that the Burmese government preserve historic buildings so that Burma can keep its flavor and not just turn into another big Asian city like Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Seoul, etc., with all the skyscrapers and just kind of lost of its cultural heritage. And so there's he talks about one building having a special history, and he writes, in 1927 the poet and future Nobel laureate Pablo Neruda lived here as a Chilean consul, during which time he had a torrid love affair with a Burmese woman named Josie Bliss, a passionate and knowledgeable lover who was, he wrote, consumed by her overwhelming jealousy and whose temper drove her to savage paroxysms. They listened to Paul Robeson records together in the sticky heat, the windows open to the pungent smells below. At night he would sometimes awaken and see her brandishing a long, sharpened native knife, trying to decide whether or not to kill him. When you die, she used to say to me, my fears will end. Neruda soon fled to Ceylon. So I just thought that was like a nice little anecdote. And I lost my page of where I was reading earlier, but it's all right. I'll find it again. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now. Super excited to read the end of this. This has been really, really super fascinating. I definitely recommend it at this point. And probably by the end of the video, I'll still be recommending it. But yeah, it's so good. Wow. Okay. So I've finished the Hidden History of Burma, A Crisis of Race and Capitalism. And I don't even know what to say. It's pure chaos. It's just, it's so complex a situation that it's really impossible to see what kind of out there would be. So it turns out the book actually does go all the way up to about June of 2020. It does talk about the pandemic at the very end in the epilogue. But yeah, but there's no mention of the current situation with the military junta coup that just recently occurred. And it's interesting. I mean, the whole Rohingya Muslim crisis is a lot deeper a situation than definitely is portrayed in the West. So much that I don't even know if I want to give too much of a statement, because so here's the thing. I think it's important to say right now that this is the very first book I read about this country. I'm still very new in reading about the politics of the Asian continent. I'm very new to reading the history of the Asian continent other than, say, Japan. And I'm not gonna have a solid opinion based off of one book. It's just not gonna happen. Even if I read several books, I'm not gonna have a solid opinion. I'm not gonna be able to make a very clear-cut statement, because as this book is so good at saying, is that the situation is so complex that you can't make a clear-cut statement. And according to which media you follow, you're gonna get a different story. So, this whole video I've been giving, very current, up-to-date thoughts on what I've been reading. But it's important to note that those are indeed all thoughts. They're all in the moment reactions to what I'm reading, and nothing is a set opinion. It's just wow this, wow that, wow this. So that's a statement I feel is very important to make. And yeah, this is really super recommended, very fantastic. I am kind of confused though about our Ansu. That's a name I'm gonna have to listen several times to remember, but Aung San Suu Kyi. I'm curious what his actual take, because there are times, and I actually do think it's an accurate representation of sort of the West versus the Burmese mindset. But it's interesting because it seems like he does very much criticize what she's been doing, or her lack of doing things, because in the way the portrayal of the construction of the current Burmese government has been portrayed, it seemed like there was actually a surprisingly great amount of economic reform under the new military junta after the end of the previous dictatorship. And that when she came into power, all of this economic reform slowed down greatly. General reform in Burma slowed down greatly, and that she doesn't actually really discuss too much about the economics and capitalism. She takes a very much more of a grandiose kind of idealist rule. Like it's almost like she's just supposed to be an image of what democracy should be. And I feel like he criticizes that, but at the same time, there does remain this idealization of the woman within the country where people still seem to be very satisfied with what she's doing. So that's very, very curious. I have to admit a little bit of confusion towards that. Who is she really, and what is the true side behind her? I think that's something we will, or maybe won't find out in the years to come. So anyway, this was incredibly fascinating. Definitely highly recommended read. And yeah, there's a lot packed into this. So anyway, if you watched up to now, thank you for watching. Please share your comments, your thoughts, your ideas, if you have any, and maybe we can have a discussion. Although, like I said, I'm not an expert. I do not have a background in economy, finance, race relations, Asian relations. I do not have a background. I am a chemist. I'm a scientist. But this was just fascinating to read. So anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys again in my next video. Bye.